The Puzzle Jug. Chapter 6. The Honorable William Gregg, Columbia, South Carolina, Monday, November 24th, 1856. The occasional leaf that clung to William Gregg's clothes might well have served as heralds for the recklessness he was about to witness today in the General Assembly. A puzzling folly that would cling to his mind as the fall leaves did to his pant leg, and linger there long after the session had ended. He fostered a soft spot in his heart for Columbia. The steady commotion of its growth exhilarated him. This town had sprouted energetic tendrils in the last 30 years. Houses were steadily creeping past the railroad, and their porches would soon overhang the banks of the river. When he started his own business as a greenhorn silversmith and clockmaker here in the 20s, Columbia was quieter, rougher around the edges, a young frontier town teetering on the brink of adolescence. This was where the skills his Uncle Jacob taught him began to work to his advantage. Fine craftsmanship was the foundation upon which he built a clientele that catered to the Southern elite. Relying upon the abilities forged into him by Jacob, he designed whatever fine items the prosperous folk might imagine they needed to be encased in silver. His practiced gentility eventually steered him closer toward his indefinable ache to be a part of their world. Walking in Columbia this morning awakened the much younger version of himself, who had retreated into a room at the very back of his mind. It was in this city where he started to understand the peculiar interplay between time and circumstance, and saw they could be yoked together for his own purposes. Gregg took advantage of opportunities to quietly slide into the sphere of the wealthy. Then he studied them with as much attention as he had the skill of watchmaking. He met James Jones, who had garnered the rank of a general in the South Carolina militia, even though he never saw the battlefield. Their upbringing was very different. In spite of that, they shared a few interests that resulted in Gregg eventually being invited to the Watson plantation. It was in Ridge Springs, James's mother's ancestral homestead. Letting the scent of the city burrow into his senses, William Gregg realized it had been a long time since he'd thought about his youthful strategy to become rich. His whole plan had been upturned into unparalleled good fortune when he met General James Jones' younger sister, Marina. Her fine features, mellow green eyes, and silky black ringlets belied her boldness. After they'd courted briefly, and when she accepted his marriage proposal on his first ask, he believed, for the first time in his life, that there might actually be a God existing somewhere. Although he was unprepared for her forthrightness, she evolved into his cornerstone. It was Marina who convinced him to sell the shop here in Columbia and take a gamble on the Vaucluse mill in the Edgefield District. How had he found the one woman who could fish the visions he sheltered for years out of the gray depths of him? Still, to this very day, she knew him from the inside out. Gregg worked like a man possessed to turn that flailing mill around in a little more than a year. It taught him lessons he hadn't been able to implement then. It took him away from his little boys and Marina for too many long nights. They decided together to sell the mill and move to Charleston. It was hardly fair of him to keep them cooped up in Edgefield, where weaving pettiness into every encounter was considered a worthy art. Gregg opened his shop with the Hayden brothers on King Street, and for 15 years he and Marina had hobnobbed with the urban plantation class, who embraced their inherited titles as if they were, indeed, royalty. It was the society his wife enjoyed, and he didn't judge her for her leisures. She'd grown up out in the middle of a cotton field in Ridge Spring. The glitter of Charleston was intoxicating, and Gregg, himself, had fallen under its spell more than once. Ultimately, though, he was a craftsman, never quite their equal, even though he could buy and sell them many times over, and he tired of their fussings easily. Eventually, he'd impressed upon his wife that their sons would be the heirs of a kind of security that no plantation owner could ever achieve. He rolled out his plans to build a mill complex that would illustrate the future clearly. The Gregg family would endure both financially and socially if they invested their energy in lifting the plight of the common man up, rather than playing in the parlors of false grandeur. He carefully explained the plans he envisioned to build a mill complex that would secure their future clearly to Marina. Through his meticulous drawings, he illustrated to her the ways in which the Gregg family would endure both financially and socially if they invested their energy in lifting the plight of the common man up rather than playing in the parlors of false grandeur. The enslavement of black people was quietly problematical to them both. Marina and Gregg shared their misgivings privately, but politely nodded along at parties and dinners when the planters complained about their human property. They discreetly paid a local family of Negroes to help with their boys.
"No work without wages,"
Gregg told them. They all assumed their roles in the antiquated institution, believing slavery would soon be outlawed, as it had been in Europe. They both knew enslavement was not sustainable unless the South was willing to take up arms, and they doubted it would go that far. For as much as the Southern privileged loved to flap their gums about independence from England, every single one of them would crawl on their belly like a reptile if Queen Victoria deigned to dub them Lord this or Lady that. They wouldn't want to be looked upon as backward bumpkins forever. Gregg breathed in the musty aroma of the damp leaves, slowing his cadence to consider the arc of his transformation from a young silversmith to the most unlikely of industrialists. He found his evolution nothing short of astonishing. He unconsciously marked off the beat of his steps from the Congaree House Hotel to the congressional chambers in his road-weary boots. Gregg had to swallow a chuckle. This obsession with the tempo of life both fascinated and troubled him. His aging body had adopted the copacetic rhythm of one of his timepieces, ceaselessly moving him forward. He chose to walk the quarter-mile between the hotel and the State House, instead of taking a carriage, just so he could watch his old calfskin boots measure out the distance. He doubted he'd keep his promise to Marina to visit a cobbler for a new pair while he was in Columbia. She had grown quite weary of his ridiculous notion that he'd somehow be insulting his old King Street friend, J.J. Cohen, if he traded this pair in for fresh ones.
"Gregg, these stivel will last you a lifetime,"
Cohen had promised him, peering over his thick half-glasses.
"Treat them as you would one of your children. Keep them clean. Gently massage tallow into them at least once a week. This is what allows the baby cowhide to cradle your tired feet like the kid glove caresses your hands."
Adjusting his waistcoat, the best he owned and one he never wore anymore, William Gregg appreciated that it afforded him easy movement. Simple in its lines and woven of fine wool, it too had been made by the persnickety, alas, now deceased, Mr. Cohen. Each crease and fold of the layered fabrics, the stretched fibers of the cotton, the velvet fleece of the wool, the support of the leather, had shaped themselves around his form. The teapots, forks, and spoons he'd pounded out of melted coin silver were woven into the threads. It was unthinkable to toss them aside because of some momentary fashion fad. He tightened the cravat at his throat. His pulse thrummed louder inside his ears as he picked up his pace. How would he mask his "I told you so" pride when an ever-independent South emerged out of the rows of sweaty souls who, up until now, were ceaselessly banging mudclods into dust? Yet the prospect of progress did nothing to ease the thread of concern that cinched tighter in his gut every day he was away from home. It was a stitch he couldn't ignore. The tightening intensified when he considered any small problem that might happen during his absence and be hidden from him, as if he wouldn't know if one of his sons played hooky, lallygagging the afternoon away under a shady tree by the creek. The anxiety it stirred in him was pervasive, so much so that he doubted he'd put much effort into the election for state senator next year. Even though Gregg appeared to most people he interacted with as riveted to the petty goings-on of this political movement or that soapbox rambling, the truth was that he was passionate about only one thing: the kingdom he had built in Graniteville. He raised up his vision from a neglected hillside, tangled in cat's claw vines and veiled by poplars and briars, a wilderness traveled only by possums and alligators on their way up from Horse Creek. He had turned that tumble into the finest timepiece he'd ever created. Because of him, looms ticked and shuttles hummed. His people, living inside the smart houses built for them and drawing paychecks from work he invented for them, were weaving centuries of their rented souls back together with each beat of the reed. The bolts of shirting and sheeting were their proof of redemption as much as his. In each waking or sleeping moment, he was nudged by a ceaselessly swaying pendulum that decided if his feet landed in his office or on the mill floor, and whether his hands were holding an ink pen to record his daily entries or setting right a spool for a weaver. At the age of 10, an orphaned William was apprenticed to his uncle Jacob and immediately immersed in the trades of silversmithing, clockmaking, and the construction of spinning machines. At the age of 10, an orphaned William was apprenticed to his uncle Jacob and immediately immersed in the trades of silversmithing, clockmaking, and the construction of spinning machines. These crafts offered a strange and unorthodox comfort to a little boy with a fallow field where his heart should have beat with the electric wonder of childhood. From the moment Uncle Jacob directed William's gaze towards the bright silver chasm, where the minute machinery of the watch was magnified through a jeweler's loupe, he was mesmerized. He wasn't fascinated so much by the mechanics of it as he was by the ineffable energy that compressed time into a single, visible point that William's eyes could travel towards. It was apparent that the internal anatomy of a watch, when disassembled, functioned no better than a human with a dismembered leg or head. Like a man, it was powered by a transcendent dynamism that no minister or saint had yet adequately defined for him. Although never able to verbalize what sort of sorcery he was witnessing, William was curious why his uncle stayed mute about the strange yet clearly obvious phenomenon. When they'd relocated to Georgia from Virginia on account of Mr. Madison's war, his uncle Jacob decided to buy a cotton mill. Stepping inside that place, the monotone sketch of William Gregg's desolate childhood broke open with the percolating colors of life. Inside this space were people animated by a shared purpose, rhythmically moving their bodies back and forth and sweeping to and fro from spool to loom, very much like the hands of a clock. Gregg would never be able to describe the dance he witnessed on the floor of that mill. The wooden jennies, in which he learned to fit the dowels, stretched out the fibers, while the women mill workers plucked the endless thread like a harp string. The music that resulted transformed one disconnected thing into whole matter. As time does to turn a boy into a man, or an idea into a movement. It was as if each worker was a conscious gear, directing all the pieces of humanity to fit together, creating something bigger than just that one body. William witnessed the generation of a cohesive natural force, like time, that kept the entire planet spinning inside a twinkling universe. The very notion that the silent millisecond in between the tick and the tock prophesied potential for a man actively transversing a space outside a clock would have been beyond preposterous to Jacob. There was little argument that his uncle was a master craftsman himself, but he focused solely on the object and its specified function in the present. Gregg couldn't tell whether his uncle had no awareness of the pulsing cosmos inside the metal mechanics of a timepiece, or if he simply chose to ignore it. Certainly his silver watches were handsome, impeccably crafted, and reflected the social standing of the men who fished them from their vest pockets. Clocks simply ticked off the passage of time that had already occurred, not the possibilities crouching in the corners of the weeks, months, and years they had yet to chronicle. Fine silver watches were meant to mark off the hours and minutes of men's lives in precise increments. Boys were destined to tick off the weeks of their childhood, not with frivolous dreams of spinning cotton into cloth with newfangled machinery. People in a mill were human cogs who had to work to eat with an eye firmly on the grave as their time ran out. A boy, a watch, and a mill worker were merely tools, granted exquisitely built ones. That was the falsehood Uncle Jacob operated under, and one that Gregg had spent the last 40 years setting right. When he'd moved on to finish his apprenticeship under Mr. Blanchard, Gregg began to tinker with the barely perceptible engines of time itself. While peering through his jeweler's loop, he experimented with unlocking a minuscule portal into the back door of eternity. The revelations he saw from standing on that threshold permanently shifted his focus. Later, in Charleston, after learning from the mistakes he'd made at the Vaucluse mill, he assembled the disconnected pieces that were buried in the soul of the orphan boy he'd once been. They were still down there, still breathing, held in stasis in that silver tunnel, waiting for him to gently grasp any future he chose with his fine-tipped tweezers and set it down wherever he pleased. Gregg had christened his mill village Graniteville because the ground upon which it stood was supported by an unyielding bed of stone, revered in both myth and proverbs as the true Rock of Ages. The waters of Horse Creek ran directly through the center of it, a constant, natural source of power that seemed to him to need direction. For Gregg, his metaphor was tethered as closely to the geology of the land as it was to the manifestation of his vision. He trusted that the material he quarried from the earth, the abundant flow of Horse Creek, and the faults he saw in his visits to northern mills were nothing if not the perfect alchemy. Although Graniteville was not the first mill village, it was the only one of its kind to be self-sustaining, equitable, and as productive as it was innovative. His mill and village were one mechanism, a time-keeping masterpiece in which the hands marched forward, ticking toward a better way of life that would elevate the South out of the Dark Ages. Graniteville sat amidst a sea of stagnating fields that were either sharecropped farms tended by disillusioned and exhausted white men, or old-world plantations tended by underfed, unwilling, and unfree black laborers. Cotton, the fruit of their sweat, had to be expensively bundled and carted to the train or river docks for shipment off to the north. This reality ultimately rendered them all as puppets, beholden to Yankees. Gregg offered small farmers a new paradigm. Graniteville Mill bought the cotton they loaded from their fields right from the back of their wagons at the end of their picking day. Poor white men didn't have to live in fear of being booted out of their shacks, and if the pressure of sharecropping bothered the plantation owners, something Gregg heard them gripe about during the monthly meetings of the Beach Island Agricultural Club, then those men were free to work on the other side of the process. They'd turn the raw material that used to flay the skin off their fingers when they wrenched it from the stems into whole cloth fine enough to fill the shelves of the shops in New York City. Those pitiful families, used to sleeping on hay and dirt floors, would finally have something more to look forward to other than eternal misery. A clean, safe home, surrounded by a garden plot for vegetables, and a school to prepare their children for their future jobs in the mill. Graniteville stood as living proof of Gregg's unwavering conviction that commerce, balanced with compassionate paternalism, would raise humans up to embrace the divine aliveness that powered the whole of them.